Without further ado, let me introduce Amanda Seligman. She is a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. She's a native of the East Coast. She got her undergrad degree at Princeton University in classics. Then in the late 90s, she pivoted to get a master's degree in urban studies at Northwestern. Since 1999, she's been on the faculty at the University of Milwaukee. She is the author of 2 books. I first became familiar with her work by seeing one of her books on display here at the library. So kudos to Joanna for getting great books like that up on the display shelf so people can start reading them. Her first book was called Block by Block. It's an analysis of the block clubs that helped kind of stabilize parts of the Chicago's West Side, which we all know is very deeply battered over the last 50 years or so. And from that, a second book emerged called Chicago's Block Clubs. And I'd be curious, I'm sure she'll probably address this, how unique or prevalent are block clubs in other jurisdictions around the country. Both of her books were published by the University of Chicago Press. She currently resides with her family in Glendale, Wisconsin, which is a suburb of Milwaukee with about 13,000 residents, and she's a member of that city's plan commission, so she probably has a lot of insights that we haven't even thought of about what we could be dealing with on Broadway. So without further ado, let me turn over the microphone to Amanda Seligman.
Thank you so much, John, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a Saturday morning, one of the most beautiful days of the year, when you could be doing anything with your time. So I'm very gratified that you would have chosen to come and make an audience for me for the next half an hour to 45 minutes or so. As John said, I'll talk for somewhere between that half an hour and 45 minutes, and that we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. Is everybody hearing me okay? Yeah. Am I a little fast, or is my speed good? Excellent. Okay. People in different parts of the country have different listening speeds. And I also often have to coach my daughter about not talking as fast as you can think, because people can't hear as fast as you can talk. So
generally, we're a little faster here in Chicago than Milwaukee.
Okay, yes. It took me a long time to get used to how slow things were in Milwaukee, but I've been teaching at UWM for more than a quarter century, and sometimes it's a little surprise to come back to a little faster paced place. Yes, I did say that correctly.
Is, generally better, but a lot of the problems people might have to do with different accents.
There's that too. Yes, thank you. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about the history of block clubs in Chicago. I'll make a special effort to talk about democracy, as John requested. I'll also have something to say about neighboring, which is one of my sort of pet themes. As John said, this work comes from my second monograph. My first monograph was about the process of racial change on Chicago's West Side in the 1950s and 1960s. And in preparing that book, there were block clubs everywhere in my research, and being immersed in Chicago as I was, people just knew what block clubs were. But when I left Chicago, went to Milwaukee, and then I would say the words block clubs to people, they would sort of look at me quizzically, and they would say, well, I know what the word block means, and I know what the word club means, but I'm not sure what that means together. And as a result of thinking about that hesitation in my interlocutors, I realized that actually we should explain what block clubs were, and then when I started digging into it, I realized there was no big history of this phenomenon, which does have a special Chicago story that I will try to be sharing with you today. And Jim, I'm going to make your life difficult because I'm a wanderer, so I'm going to go back and forth, and you're just going to have to follow me with the camera. So again, thank you for turning out today to hear me. This is not moving forward.
You're on the wrong side of it.
I'm on the wrong
Minus
side. We had this plugged in. We did test it before. All right, I think I might have to do it manually.
What's it supposed to be aimed at?
Are you turning it on for me, Brad? Thank you. Brad Your neighbor Brad Hunt is a friend of mine from grad school, so he and I have known each other for 30 years, and I always give him my dessert.
Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, what is a block club? You guys know what block clubs are because you're part of Chicago and you may even belong to EPIC, or you're the larger or the smaller subset. But because I talk about this phenomenon to non-Chicago audiences, it's important to explain. As far as I can tell, block clubs are the smallest form of community-based organization in the United States. They literally are often just a face block, sometimes even just one side of the street, or maybe facing, maybe sometimes a square block, maybe sometimes an accumulation, but they are very tiny organizations. They're also voluntary. Nobody makes you join a block club. That's entirely your choice as a resident of a block or maybe another kind of stakeholder, which I'll have a little bit more to say going forward. And then the membership may include residents, may also include business owners if it's a block that is mixed in its usage, and it may include, in a very few cases, absentee landlords as well. But usually it's the people who live on the block who are very concerned about making that space what they want the space to be. There are two other kinds of organizations that you may also think of when you hear about block clubs, and I'd like to just take a moment to distinguish them from homeowners associations. Homeowners associations tend to be mandatory. They tend to have been created by a developer of a particular area who, in an effort to protect the property investment that he made and then that the subsequent buyers made, created a legal mechanism that would require the residents of that area to join, and then to be bound by certain covenants, like you can't paint your house red, or you can't put signs in your window, or whatever other things they believe would protect the property values. And the contrast is that while there may be similar neighborhood improvement aims, block clubs are voluntary. They don't have the status that courts would enforce, whereas courts have found that homeowners associations are sort of quasi-governmental organizations or contracts that people are bound to obey, and if you don't like your homeowners association, you either have to join the leadership of it, or you have to leave the property altogether. There's not really an escape, whereas the block club you could just ignore if you wanted. And then community organizations or community-based organizations, they have another long history that would be a different talk, but community organizations in the United States do tend to be larger than block clubs. They may take up an entire neighborhood or community area in Chicago, and they often become large enough that they get a 501c3 status with the federal government. That gives them tax exempt, but also sort of recognition from the government. Whereas block clubs, because they are so tiny and usually have small, minimal dues, don't reach the level that it would make sense to sign up with the government, and in fact also don't often have the staff, the person power to make that happen. So they just exist. And one scholar who's written about the history of community organizations used the phrase "the dark matter of the nonprofit world," which basically was a way of saying that there exist in the United States associations that are nonprofit organizations, but they just fly under the radar because they don't rise to the level of federal attention or even state attention, and block clubs fall into that category. This also reminds me to say what I forgot to say at the outset, which is that if any of you are low vision or want to see the slides later, I've given Jim a copy of the slides. The slides all have alt text, so you can read descriptions of the images. Okay, so there's my basic introduction. Let me tell you a couple takeaways that I have about block clubs. I was very surprised when I started thinking about them systematically to learn that block clubs, while they sound like they're indigenous grassroots organizations, have actually historically mostly been cultivated from the top down. That is, that larger organizations like the Chicago Urban League, like the Chicago Police Department, have intentionally cultivated block clubs as a way of promoting civic engagement. That was really a big surprise to me. I was also really surprised about the Chicago Police Department's CAPS program and the way in which they were involved with block clubs. It's my belief that CPD is one of the 2 largest organizers of block clubs in Chicago history. That the other large one that happened was during World War II, when 20,000 blocks in the Chicago area were organized into block clubs for the purposes of civil defense, and then they sort of petered out. Sorry? Yes, some of them did Victory Gardens, that's right. And especially in the early part of this century that we're living in, CPD had a similar effort to organize block clubs in the city, and had a staff at one point, I believe, of 24 civilian community organizers whose entire job was to create and cultivate block clubs. The other thing that really surprised me, but also made sense when I started thinking about them, was that block clubs tend to be very short-lived. They are voluntary, because they're voluntary organizations. When the people who created them or ran them ran out of energy without a succession plan, or moved out of the neighborhood, or got sick, or got busy with their families, or all the things that happen to busy, talented people who tend to run things, block clubs can die really easily. There was a study done in New York City of block clubs in which the scholar who was investigating them had a list, a very long list of them, and could only find about 1/3 of them 2 years after the list was created. Wow. So they do go out of existence, which is one of the reasons that Edgewater is important. Those of you who are involved in EPIC, EPIC is one of the longest lived block organizations in Chicago history. I saw on the website that you're up to your 50th anniversary, and that has, I think, stemmed in part from the size of the organization. This image is a map that is on the website. Then there's all these little sub areas, and even the sub areas you can see here are larger than a face block organization. So,
Amanda, just for clarification, that map is of all of Edgewater.
Yes.
EPIC is just one of the numerous block clubs.
And it's not the oldest.
So
EGA is 52 years old.
And Lakewood Balmoral goes back to the
yeah,
19th, and ENN goes to the 1970s too.
Thank you for that clarification. And then let me just talk a little bit about the larger significance, why these are worth studying beyond the fact that they're a curious and delightful kind of organization. One is it gives us a larger understanding of the scope of the voluntary sector in the United States. That's a field that people are interested in knowing more about. What's the role of philanthropy and 501c3s and nonprofit organizations in shaping American cities? Block clubs also help us understand the variations that occur within cities. So why do some blocks look really well kept while others seem neglected? Sometimes the answer to that question is that there's an active block club that is running cleanups and helping people invest in their time and effort in their block. And then I'm very interested in the idea of neighboring as a phenomenon. How do people relate to their neighbors? And I do have a little bit more to say about that. One is that while neighboring sounds like a great value, it turns out that neighbors don't always get along. There's a whole internet genre that I was surprised to discover of neighboring horror stories, people who leave dead animals on their neighbors' porches or have parties late at night. You can actually really not get along with your neighbors, even though it sounds like something you would like. From a scholarly sense, it's not so important to a public audience, but I like to say it anyway, there's been a very long tradition in urban history of talking about community, but community is always a positively loaded value. Nobody talks about really community as being negative, but neighboring, I think, helps us better understand the range of experiences that people have in a local place. I also think that it's important to think about neighbors as a temporally bounded form of interaction. It's a relationship, and it's a time-limited relationship. If I move away, like I've done to Milwaukee, I'm no longer your neighborhood, rather than being an identity, which is something that you carry with you for a much longer time and is less relational than neighboring. And then there's times of crisis that bring neighboring into high relief. I was just reminded that this is the 30th anniversary of the Great Heat Wave of 1995, which, as we know, many of our neighbors died in, but also people were protected from death and severe injury by neighbors who were looking out for them. So I think it's a key to understanding how people relate to one another. And that occurred again during the pandemic when people made little clusters and found relationships with their neighbors as long as those events occurred outside. And then of course there's a long list of ways in which neighboring appears in popular culture. My favorite of which is Mr. Rogers, who wrote that lovely song, Won't You Be My Neighbor? Also, democracy is important, and block clubs help us understand and are a manifestation of the experience of democracy in American life. They're an example of local self-governance, voluntary, rather than the larger scale electoral democracy, but they help us, by participating in block clubs, we begin to cultivate the habits of democracy that make us all better civically engaged. However, there's some caveats that I would offer. One is that the variations of democracy are not all positive ones. So I'll give you some examples later on, but I'll highlight two now, is that when people are deciding who their neighbors are, how they want to relate to neighbors, and what those relationships would be like, they sometimes decide against the people who are near to them and exacerbate existing differences. So the Chicago Urban League, which I'll explain in a few moments, was the most important catalyst of block clubs in Chicago history, tried to encourage the members who were forming block clubs to be inclusive, but they always started with property owners, and those property owners sometimes wrote constitutions for their block clubs that specifically excluded tenants from belonging to the block clubs. Similarly, the Southwest Associated block clubs, which were created in the 1960s, were specifically created in order to hold the color line, that is, to stop African Americans from moving into white neighborhoods. So those are not things that we would necessarily approve of in the 21st century, but nonetheless were manifestations of local democratic feelings. So democracy is a mixed bag. There's other things that teach us that as well. I will also say that block clubs have been particularly important in Chicago's black community. As I mentioned, the Urban League was intentionally trying to cultivate local leadership. They knew that lots of people had been migrating to Chicago from the South. They wanted to demonstrate that blacks made good neighbors, and they used block clubs as a way of cultivating that leadership, so in hopes that the leaders in those clubs would then go on to participate in other forms of civic engagement. It was not a training academy, but it was definitely a training ground. And one of the manifestations of the success of that approach was that when people who had been leaders in block clubs died, they often made sure, their descendants made sure to include their leadership of block clubs in their obituaries as examples of their civic engagement and commitment to democracy. Why do I focus on Chicago? Well, partly it was, I knew about it and it was convenient, but Chicago also has a special place in the history of block clubs. I don't think it's an accident that I sort of started paying attention to what was happening with block clubs here, because there is a more than century-long history of Chicagoans engaging in block club organizing with themselves and their neighbors. But this is not to say that other cities don't also have block clubs. This list of places on the left-hand side of the screen are places where I have found mentions of block clubs. And my guess is that Buffalo in New York is the most organized city in the country. I don't have great data for that, so I say it with a little bit of a caveat, but there is scholarship on block clubs in Buffalo, and it is a smaller city, and it seems to be disproportionately organized. I'm hoping that somebody will one day, I'll say this, and somebody will go and do that project and help me understand it a little better. But so far, nobody in Buffalo has asked me to come give a talk about block clubs. Maybe you have a connection who will get me there. I do think that Chicago is sort of the most important leader city in the history of block clubs in the United States. How do I know about the history of block clubs? Okay, this was a real challenge. This is not a project that I could have done as a graduate student. The evidence, whoops, thank you, Brad, wrong way. The evidence for block clubs is both fragmented and fragmentary. And what I mean by that is historians go out and do their research in archives. That's most of what we do. Sometimes we talk to people. I didn't do much of that, I'm too shy. And I really loved archival work. Here, I'll go to the other side so you can see the screen a little bit better. So the evidence for block clubs is scattered in many, many different archives across the city. And I knew about them because of my previous work. And then when I began to work on this project more systematically, I looked for other examples. And they really are just all over the place. But they're difficult to find because librarians did not think of them as a phenomenon that we should be studying, and so they didn't catalog examples of block clubs, which made them harder to find. And the evidence that is sustained is also fragmentary, so they're just little snippets of information. There's very rare examples of the entire history of a block club whose materials have been archived. The exception is the 15th Place Block Club, whose materials are part of the Faith Ridge collection, which is housed at the Special Collections Unit in the Harold Washington Public Library downtown. Faith Ridge was this phenomenal woman who was a white woman with a PhD from Bryn Mawr College, which is, by the way, where my daughter attends, and she moved to Chicago. She was very left-leaning. She might have been a communist, I'm not really sure, because the evidence is totally unclear in her archive, but she and her husband intentionally, as white people moved into Lawndale as it was becoming African American, and she was very civically engaged. She had a very strong sense of what we would now call white privilege, and she didn't cast herself into the top leadership roles in the organization she was involved in. She always intentionally picked a role that drew on her strengths as a writer and scholar and researcher, and that usually meant that she was the secretary of the organization, and she would type up notes and help people write letters, etc. And she understood the importance of the archive that she created, and when she died, her husband, Ted, kind of toted her papers on the L to the library and said, please take these, and would just bring more and more. And so they were these terribly messy boxes when I first looked at them, but they're very nicely organized now. And because Faith Ridge was such a phenomenal record keeper, there is a full run of the 15th Place Block Club materials that covered decades. That gave me great insight into what block clubs were like.
Do you know what years roughly they were covering?
About the 1950s to about the 1980s. There was a long article about Faith Ridge in the Chicago Reader, which you can dig up if you're interested. I also did a little bit of research on the internet. That's, for example, how I found out that Buffalo was so important in the history of block clubs. But when Block Club Chicago came into being, like 10 years ago, it totally ruined my Google News search, because now every day I get emails that say there's news about block clubs. And it's just the name shows up. So it's much harder to do internet research on block clubs than it used to be. Without criticizing the coverage that they offer, it's just I can't do that research that way anymore. It's also very hard to estimate the number of block clubs in Chicago at any given time, partially because they're so transitory, but also because the evidence is so fragmented and fragmentary. I collaborated on a project that I'll talk very briefly about at the end of this with Wes Scogan from Northwestern, who managed to get us data from CAPS about how many block clubs there were in 2017. And at that moment, there were about 1,500 block clubs in Chicago, but how active they were is unclear. And of course, only the block clubs that wanted to sign up with the Chicago Police Department are counted in that list, and some people in the city are skeptical of CPD and would not have chosen to affiliate themselves. So I don't, anywhere in my book on block clubs, say how many block clubs there were, because I am not confident in any numbers that I would give. The range, maybe, the lower bound is probably 1,500, as in the CAPS database. The upper bound would have been that 20,000 during World War II. But that's a really wide variation. But I would just be skeptical of anyone who told you exactly how many block clubs there were in Chicago, because they're very difficult to count. And just counting them would be a really big job, and the data would only be good for a year or so, and then you'd have to start over. Another question that is important to understand is whether block clubs are political. And this is something that I really had to work through in writing this book. And I started out by saying no, and then I was eventually persuaded by my outside readers to say yes. And here's my argument for how to understand block clubs as political. I understand them as political in the sense, here's my classics major coming out, that is used in ancient Greek. Our word metropolitan comes from the Greek word polis, which means city. And because block clubs are fundamentally creatures of urban places and are concerned with the state of cities, they are fundamentally or basically political. But how the block clubs have thought about engagement with politics has varied considerably over time as well. You might imagine those CPD block clubs are in some ways definitely political because they have chosen to affiliate with the city government through the Chicago Police Department. But when the Urban League, in the earlier part of the 20th century, was creating block clubs, they were adamant that their work was not political. And what they meant by that was that it was not partisan, and it was not to be associated with machine politics. And there were moments that are captured in the archives in which the precinct captain sort of showed up to a block club meeting, and the Urban League people were like, no, we are not affiliated with the machine, because they wanted to be independent. And the precinct captains then sort of left the room, but partially because they were offended by that. But it's a delicate line to watch because block clubs also can work to agitate for city services. That's one of the things that's effective about block clubs, is that instead of an individual going to the alderman or the precinct captain saying, we need better trash pickup on our street, if a group that was organized and had some tenure asked for the same thing, they might get better coverage. So that was a difficult line for the Urban League to walk. And then in the 21st century, a little bit in the late 20th century as well, there were some aldermen in the city who regarded organizing block clubs for their constituents literally as a constituent service. In the book I cite the example of Amaya Pawar, who did this quite systematically during his tenure, but there have been others as well in Chicago who understood that if you wanted to hear from your constituents, which I understand aldermen don't always want to do, one way to do that would be through the instrument of the block club. So they organized them, or they got their staff to organize them for them. And then the leadership approaches that are intersecting with politics that block clubs engage in, included, as I suggested, leveraging government services, trash pickup, tree planting, assistance with beautification, cooperation with CAPS, especially in the area of so-called positive loitering. They also ran their own programs. As I was driving in this morning, I noticed that there's here in Edgewater, you have a second Sunday in July garden walk, right? That's another example. And then they also sometimes just served as models without trying to overtly pressure their neighbors into activity, but they argued that if most of the houses on the block clean up their properties or put up Christmas lights, then other people will be inspired to do so as well, and that will effectively improve the neighborhood or the block, even if we don't really, put pressure on them too. So those are all ways in which I would say block clubs are political. And let me just say an image, something about this image, which is one of my favorites that I found in the course of doing this research. This is a bunch of block club members who were carrying signs in 1968. You can see this is September 1968, and their signs say things like 3 cheers for Mayor Daley, America, we love you, Southwest Associated Block Clubs support Chicago's police. What do you think they might have been responding to? Exactly, thank you. So they saw what had happened at the Democratic Convention in 1968, which had, of course, gotten international attention. There's that famous chant, the whole world is watching. And they were on the side of the police who were beating up the protesters in Lincoln Park. And they were on the side of the police because many of their neighbors were members of Chicago Police Department. And so they went and made a demonstration of support outside the local CPD branch headquarters. Again, political engagement.
Have you done any study of the change in political power of block clubs. Anecdotally, in the years I've lived here, it seems like 3 or more aldermen ago, they wouldn't do anything without consulting with all the local block clubs. And then that seems to have changed so dramatically now. There are people in power taking positions diametrically opposed to what the block clubs are asking the aldermen to do. Is that just a local one-off thing, or is that a overall trend?
You have a neighbor behind you who wants to.
I go back to the 70s, and we were run by a machine. We were a colony of the machine, and the block clubs became the opposition, and the board committeemen and all. They didn't want to hear from the block clubs, and the block clubs then became a petri dish for what became 50 years of significant community leadership in politics as well as other civic activities.
Yeah, so I think this is a great
kind of model that happened here with block clubs.
Yeah, I think this is a great and rich question, and my personal answer is no, I haven't done that research, because I thought of this project as a basic excavation of the history of block clubs, which I'm about to narrate for you, and I hoped that by creating this book and having the public libraries in Chicago have it on their shelves, and maybe by talking to folks, I would inspire somebody else to go and do that research. I've moved on and I'm working on other things
We're kind of
right
doing
now.
it as we
But
go along.
if you want to get together with your neighbors and write that, bless you, or if you want to get Brad Hunt to get some of his grad students at Loyola to work on it, that would be a great project for them, and I would be delighted to read it.
But now we're back to what it was 50 years ago, when top down, and the elected officials don't trust the block clubs because
Yeah, I think that's definitely a project that is worth doing.
pendulum swing, right, John?
So to sort of circle back to the larger history, I want to start with the work of block clubs at the national level and how they came to Chicago, and why people have thought historically in Chicago, I don't think they think so anymore, but historically thought that block clubs were a particularly black form in Chicago, and that is because they come out of black organizations, in particular the National Urban League, which starting in cities like Atlanta, where there was a small but very influential cluster of African American intellectuals, started to organize block clubs and mothers clubs, and spread the idea through the network of the National Urban League to other cities like St. Louis and Pittsburgh and Chicago, and they took special root in Chicago through the Chicago Urban League, which, as you know, is one of the 2 most important civil rights organizations in Chicago history in the 20th century, the other one, of course, being the NAACP. And people often understand them as sort of complementary organizations. The Chicago Urban League is most famous for doing what was called industrial work, in which they tried to help migrating African Americans identify jobs that they could take and therefore bring their whole families north and migrate as a family and not just as individuals. And the Urban League had limited funds, as many nonprofits did in the 20th century and continue to. And when they had some extra money, they also engaged in block club organizing in order to cultivate local leadership. But whenever funds got tight, like during the Depression, they focused only on the industrial placement work and let the block club work fall to the side. That we had to make a budgetary choice. We only have limited funds. What are we going to do? Jobs are more important. But they revived that program after World War II. But because they had been so active in the 1920s and block clubs were familiar to Chicagoans, when the Office of Civilian Defense was created in order to prepare the United States for the possibility of invasion, the local organization, which was run by the mayor and covered a little bit of Northwest Indiana as well as some of the suburbs, they organized block clubs as a way of doing some of the things that you're already familiar with from the history of World War II, including raising money for bonds, having victory gardens, and my favorite example is preparing for air raids. And one of the things that happened is that they would plan blackouts, and everybody had black things to cover their windows. And the idea was that if you could change the light pattern of Chicago, you would confuse German pilots into thinking they were over a city other than Chicago. You would basically change their perception of the space they were in, and block clubs were instrumental in practicing those. They also did some very local service for their neighbors, like when young men on the block were drafted or chose to go into the military, they would raise money to send them Easter cards and Christmas cards with cigarettes and a little bit of money that they could spend at their local canteen where they were deployed. So they also, in addition to engaging in the national defense effort, supported their neighbors who were deployed elsewhere. Then after World War II, there was a revival of block club organization in Chicago. The Urban League, again, became very active in promoting block clubs among Southern migrants. And then members of the Hyde Park Community Conference kind of went to a citywide conference and meeting and got wind of what the Urban League was doing and organized particularly on their area of the south side of Chicago. And because there were so many scholars and writers and intellectuals associated with the Hyde Park Kenwood Community Conference, they also wrote about what they were doing and went and talked about it to other groups in the city as an example of what they should be doing. They didn't give quite enough credit to the Urban League, so some people thought that's just the Hyde Park Kenwood Community Conference work, but in fact they owed a debt of origins to the Urban League. Because of the work from Hyde Park and their ability to go out and get an audience in Chicago, block clubs did proliferate in the city in many neighborhoods in the 1950s and 1960s, often in association with one of two things: the urban renewal efforts, which, although that has a very bad reputation, in part due to James Baldwin's very pithy description of urban renewal as Negro removal, on a literal policy level, urban renewal needed the cooperation of some neighbors in a legal sense. And so organizations that were engaged in the urban renewal process also went and created block clubs. That's part of the top-down. And then the other example was through the organizing processes of Saul Alinsky, who was personally skeptical of block clubs in Hyde Park, where he lived, but who understood their political potential. And when he and the organizers that he cultivated were brought into neighborhoods in order to create larger organizations, block clubs often became constituent organizations in those places like Uptown and Austin and other neighborhoods as well.
A friend of mine in Hyde Park said the unofficial motto of that group, Hyde Park Kenwood Community Conference, was white people and black people working together to keep out poor people.
That is a very pithy description. And if you're interested in that, by the way, there's a foundational book in our field called Making the Second Ghetto by the historian Arnold Hirsch that describes that in incredible depth. So I would commend that book to you. Block club organizing continued. They got a big boost in the 1990s with the work of the Chicago Police Department, that CAPS program, as I indicated. And then this new group, do you guys know My Block, My Hood, My City?
Yeah.
So Jamal Cole has kind of made a name for himself in the city, and he has people organized to shovel their neighbors' sidewalks. And I'll also show you the signs that he and his group have made. And he's a pretty savvy person who's interested in building his public career as well. He, as you may know, ran for Congress a couple years ago, but did not get elected.
What's his name?
Jamal Cole.
Cole.
C-O-L-E.
He's in the media a lot.
Yeah, yeah. So block club purposes, they are often, especially in the older days, expressed negatively. I'd like to thank David Salk for letting me use these photos of block club signs, which you probably have seen around the city. David Salk kind of collects them. And they often had sort of a big word no, and a list of all the rules that the block clubs were trying to implement on their particular block. So here's one from the south side that says, no gangs, no drugs or alcohol, loitering, soliciting, gambling, ball playing, loud music, fighting, car washing, or repairs, littering, double parking, and we call the police. So that's a very negative expression of the purposes of the Block Club. I have to say, I love the cover of my book that the University of Chicago Press made with Block Club signs on the cover. But I said to them, you know, keep it as it is, but how is anyone going to buy a book that has the word no on it 13 times on the cover? Oh well. A little easier to read one here from South Walcott: no loitering, car washing, or repair. That's a really dirty activity that leaves a lot of pollution on the street. No speeding, drug trafficking, loud music, and oh, there's a little bit of a positive thank you. Block clubs also express their purposes more positively as well. My favorite one is the Block of Unity here from 82nd and Morgan, which has these very soft colors, the soft focused flowers in the back room. And they say, help us keep it safe, clean, and green. And they literally have photographs of all the bungalows on the block that demonstrate how they want the houses to be kept up there. It's just quite lovely. And I also really enjoy this one from the west side, which is bilingual and basically says welcome in 2 languages rather than saying a whole bunch of negative things. It says neighbors working together for our community benefit and safety. It's very vague as to what they're up to, but it projects the idea of what the Block Club is trying to accomplish among its neighbors instead of scolding them. Jamal Cole has been involved in getting young people from his organization to paint new signs for Block Clubs that are not quite as negative or neglected. You can sort of notice the age on these, especially the one on the left. So he got his kids to paint new signs that had a lovely exhibit a couple years ago. This one says welcome, and it's in Pan-African colors, talking about or reflecting the African history. Here's the one with this lovely willow tree, and there's text down here that's really too small for me to read at the moment. This one projects love on the left, Martin Luther King and love. This one on the right from South Peoria reflects, I don't think that's a gay rainbow, I think it's just a happy rainbow. And let us share the benefits we have gained for ourselves with others. So again, expressing the kind of civic engagement and planting that outside so that neighbors all see what the message is. The Block Clubs have engaged in all kinds of activities. Part of what I had to struggle with in writing the book was how to organize it, because I had all that fragmented evidence, and I tried to sort of classify it by the kinds of things that Block Clubs did. So one of the things that they focused on was cleansing and beautifying the neighborhood. So a very ordinary, very normal activity of Block Clubs is to organize cleanups, get all the kids to go out in the alley on a Saturday morning and pick up the trash, or clean the parkway together, whatever. They also would reward those kids with a party, with popsicles, soft drinks, hot dogs afterwards, and that would not just make the kids feel more civically engaged, but it would foster social connections among the neighbors. And in some places, especially in the southwest side of the city, really the only things Block Clubs do are to have annual parties where they shut down the street and everybody comes out and the kids go in a bouncy house because they've had too many popsicles, and the neighbors drink beer. They also have been engaged in promoting safety. That's part of the alliance with Chicago Police Department. Sometimes reporting to police, as indicated on that previous sign. One Block Club, I think on the south side, was trying to get gang members off their street, and their strategy was to have everybody turn on their sprinklers at the same time, and that would just encourage people who were selling drugs to go somewhere else because they didn't want to get wet. And then they would also try to regulate their neighbors' behavior, for example, through those various signs that I indicated. And I think some of you sort of read this list. There is a tradition in Black Chicago, out of the days of the Urban League, of literally telling people how to behave and giving lists of behavior, both for the sake of your neighborly life and also to stop white people from thinking negative things about black people in the city. Excuse me, I just need a little water. I'm not going to read that out to you. They were very involved in cleanliness, so there was a concerted effort at mid-century to get Chicagoans to put their trash into garbage cans to prevent the proliferation of rats, and that often involved giving garbage cans with lids to neighbors and then carefully educating them about how to use it, and as opposed to just, excuse me, dumping things into the wooden barrels that their landlords provided. And then also often in the summertime especially, creating social activities to harness the energies of young people. So here these kids are encouraged to engage in a potato sack race rather than do what other things that kids might do that the older folks would not love. Excuse me, I had a conversation with my daughter about why potato sacks, and we're like, okay, they're heavy and sturdy, that's why they do that. But you could also have had a, a three-legged race or whatever other things that would burn off kids' energy. Block clubs are particularly attentive to the physical environment on their street, and they can't always manage private property, but sometimes they are able to. And I've been tracking this block on the northwest side through the beauty of Google Street View for more than a decade. And the oldest one is down here, and you can see that there's this kind of neglected vacant lot, and the landlord has put up a fence to keep people from using it. But over the years, the contents of the vacant lot have improved over time. So in this one, which was the second image I took, you can see these little red dots at the bottom are actually kind of Adirondack chairs, which gave neighbors the opportunity to use that vacant lot as a parklet. And then when I was surprised when I visited block again using Google Street View, to see that they have like picnic tables with umbrellas, and the sort of lot seems even better in the picture that I took preparing this talk as well. So this is the work of the block club, as evidenced by archival research that is not manifested in the street. But they're trying to make community spaces for their neighbors, rather than allowing a vacant lot to be a negative space that would attract garbage and whatever other things happen in vacant lots that you don't want to have happen. There are, as I suggested in response to a question, lots of open research questions about block clubs. Is this still on? There we go. That I hope somebody will pick up the answer to. Brad, again, this is for you and your students. Since you're right here in Chicago, it's much harder for my students to do this research in Milwaukee, except for the very first one, block clubs in other places than Chicago. I do occasionally get contacted by folks in like Minneapolis, where there's also active block clubs, but we just don't know what the larger national history is, because people haven't picked up my call for research yet. I'm particularly interested to know more about block clubs on the northwest and southwest sides of Chicago. Most of my research comes from records of organizations like the Urban League that are already deposited in archives, and organizations from the northwest and southwest side just haven't had the same benefit of having their records saved. Suburbs are sort of similarly fragmented, and boy, it's hard to go to lots of different places in order to do research. And then again, other metropolitan areas. The larger history of neighborhood level government. We know quite a bit about how urban governance has worked historically in the United States, but we don't necessarily know how groups like the ones that you're involved in have engaged with governance and created variations in the cities. There's more to be done on CPD's block club programs, and about 6 years ago, I started being really interested in the relationship between block clubs and crime. I was just like, what happens if people think that block clubs lower crime, and if people are actively engaged with CPD, what's the actual reality? But I'm a qualitative historian. I don't have any of the skills to do that. So I found a collaborator. Actually, I found two collaborators, one Wes Scogan at Northwestern, who had the CPD data, and then a wonderful scholar at Marquette, neighboring University of Milwaukee, who analyzes actually the effects of liquor stores on neighborhoods, and she just used the same data methods to analyze.
We had some clean on that topic.
So to analyze what's the effect of block clubs, and it was fascinating, the results, which then we spent 5 years trying to get published. It turns out that block clubs, at least through CPD, are highly correlated with crime, rather than being negatively correlated. And what we conclude, we just had one moment in time. It seems counterintuitive, but what we figured out, or what we think, is that CPD's efforts were concentrated in high crime areas, and that CPD's efforts were taken up by residents of high crime areas,
Yeah.
where residents of areas with less crime didn't feel so compelled to respond to CPD's calls. So that correlation is not causation, right? If you get the link from, if you get this article from Jim, or get this slideshow from Jim, that's a link to it, but you can also sort of Google me or send me an email and I'll send you to the
What was the name of the researcher from Marquette?
her name is Alexandra Snowden. Yes, Snowden, and she's actually the lead author, because all I did was really ask the question and she did all the hard work of getting it published.
What was the time frame for that?
It's literally just that 2017 data.
2017.
Yeah, so we don't have subsequent data, we don't have a longitudinal study. Again, we're hoping other people will pick up the thread and do the research. There may be things that you want to know as well, so we're happy to talk about it in the questions and answers. There's my book with the word no over and over again. Let me hear what you're interested in knowing about. Yes.
With all due respect to Chicago police, if people may not realize the CAP program, the seeds of that started here in Edgewater. Tell you a little bit about the politics of the police. In those days that they didn't want to meet with block clubs, and this is when the local commanders were politically, quote, acceptable to the local political officials, whether it was the Seligman or the alderman, and they really didn't like meeting with block clubs. It's like, don't tell us how to do our job. And there's a fellow here who was very active in the community, a fellow named Edgewater Public Library, who got very involved and helped initiate a whole citywide coalition. So it didn't come from the police. It really came from a lot of block clubs and organizations getting together. And he and Warren Friedman, the fellow was from Rogers Park, became the co-chairs of the citywide coalition of block clubs that got the city to do that. And between that and the election of Carl Washington as mayor, there began to be changes in the attitude of the police towards the block clubs. And that's just from our experience here, but it's they really did not want block clubs telling them how to police. And some of us who work in radio patrol, things like that in the neighborhood, we know that they have attitudes that police had from at least that's true.
I think that's a great example of a history that really needs to be delved into. It was actually very, the section I have on CAPS in the book is disproportionate to what I've said in the talk today. I've mentioned it several times, but it's really, I just have a few pages in the book because it's actually really hard to do research on the history of policing in Chicago. The research has gotten better in recent years, and I would particularly commend to you Simon Balto's book called Occupied Territory, which is particularly about African Americans and CPD. And again, quoting James Baldwin, that's where that title comes from. But CPD's annual reports say almost nothing about block clubs. They don't tell that story, and so that's something I would love for somebody to go into greater depth on, and it looks like they should come talk to you. Yes?
We recently had a talk about areas in Chicago which have the proportion of college-educated people since the 1980s to today, and how this area has always had a high proportion of college-educated people. Hyde Park, obviously, but it's expanding to the west, up in the north part of the city, and a bit around Hyde Park. And I'm wondering if that correlates with effectiveness of block clubs or longevity of block clubs.
Yeah, so this is a question about the relationship between college education and block clubs. And I would suggest that college education closely correlates with wealth as well. It's not one-to-one, but you can sometimes use it as a proxy. And I think that block clubs are actually much more common in working class, blue-collar neighborhoods than in ones that are wealthy, college-educated neighborhoods. And I think the reason for that is that people who have more wealth have more ability to do stuff with their property that block clubs also want done in less wealthy neighborhoods and require a little community boost to make happen. So if you can, if you're well enough off, you can just spend money to clean up your house, and your neighbors have that money and are shamed into also cleaning up their property. Unless, by the way, unless you're me, and we're the worst homeowners on my block. Ironically, for somebody who's done so much work on the history of homeownership, and the nuns across the street literally told me that our hedge was interfering with their prayer practice. That's my husband's fault. I'm going to blame him for that. Whereas in blue-collar neighborhoods, some homeowners have enough means to upkeep their property, but needed the social pressure to persuade their less wealthy neighbors to put in the sweat equity required to maintain their homes to the standard that they were expecting. Yes?
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting to me is the period of the 1970s, but just because I was involved in block clubs starting in the 1970s. And I have two thoughts about it. One of them is that if you look at our neighborhood, and we were looking at that map earlier, and we were telling you there's all these block clubs, there's these 14 block clubs drawn out on this historic map of Edgewater. I don't really know where it comes from other than the EHS has been the keeper of it, but I think that it may have come out of a period of time in which the community council and these community organizations were facilitating and wanted to see how the neighborhood's divided up. It's not like it was one little island here and one little island there. The notion was the whole of Edgewater was going to have a block club. And as some of the history of Edgewater, I think, I've learned this through EHS members, Kathy Gemperly being primary, that Lakewood Balmoral Residence Council was the first, and it came out of redlining that white people, it didn't have anything to do with your color, it had to do that redlining had made it impossible to get a mortgage in what is these big, beautiful historic homes in Lakewood Balmoral. So it was an interesting thing, and then out of that comes a block club, out of that comes Edgewater Community Council, and then comes the entire neighborhood, so that we have all these block clubs that go back to that period of the 1970s then. So I was just curious, at 1970s and the relationship with community organizations. I worked in South Shore, lived in South Shore in the 1970s, and the South Shore Commission was instrumental in keeping the South Shore Bank there to lend and locally, but also in creating block clubs in South Shore.
And we have a beautiful Leroy Blummer who helped organize a lot of block clubs. Leroy?
Yeah, so I could give a whole talk on block club, but my preference, the term neighborhood associations, but I won't. But I'll point you to a place where you can find as much information as we've developed, and that's our website. So if you go to our website, edgewaterhistory.org, and search in the search feature block clubs, and you will find all information that we have on block clubs. And we have archives in our museum, mostly from LBRC, but others as well. And we developed the history of the genesis of most of them. We don't have all of them. There are a few, and you would expect the ones that are the most stable, the ones that are most robust. Western Broadway and are composed primarily of single-family homes. East of Broadway, they're in name only. They were active one time, but they're not active today.
Oh, yes.
There's two block clubs east of
Yeah,
Broadway.
so anyway, if you're interested, check out our website.
I am interested in your answer.
Yeah, so I would say that there's also,
Development in Edgewater has been very different from your research, like on southwest and northwest side and the black communities.
so I do think so.
They were single blocks. They were never like a single block in Edgewater.
Edgewater has a distinct story for block clubs for sure.
I also want to mention something
Can I answer this question first?
Yeah, I had asked a question first.
So
I bounced over to you, but.
So let me answer this question and then come back to you. So I do think that looking at the histories of the archives of those larger organizations is very helpful, especially the ones that were involved partially in urban renewal and partially in other kinds of community preservation efforts, because they did organize block clubs. The one thing that was missing from what you said that I think would also be worth considering as you want to dig more into this is the relationship between Uptown and Edgewater, right? So Edgewater was not part of the original system of community areas that were designated by the University of Chicago sociologists in the early part of the 20th century. It was just part of Uptown. And as Uptown became particularly diversified in the 1960s with people of a huge variety of ethnic origins, including Southern Appalachians, people who lived in Edgewater did not particularly care to associate with the diversity and poverty in Uptown, and so named Edgewater as a separate organization. And not this building, but the predecessor library building was part of the process of getting Edgewater created as a distinct entity within the city of Chicago. So as you explore that, I would say look at that topic as well.
You know, I mean, I was involved very in getting Edgewater recognized, and it was based on the history of Edgewater. It came out of the Edgewater Community Council.
Yeah, Edgewater existed before Uptown.
And I will say that the community areas labels are imperfect for a lot of reasons, but that the only two real amendments to the basic structure that was put down were the creation of the O'Hare community area, number 76, and then Edgewater, number 77. But it is definitely
At
imperfect.
that point, it's incorrect to say that it was as a result of residents wanting to disassociate themselves from it.
Well, again, I think that's a research topic that can be developed.
How it happened, you know, and Bob and I were involved.
My real question though was, is it a scenario that you've seen elsewhere of these larger community organizations promoting their whole neighborhood being you know, block clubs as a subset of the larger organization?
I think Edgewater is the premier example of that. That in neighborhoods like Lawndale, North Lawndale, where there was an effort for urban renewal that was spearheaded by Sears before it moved to the Sears Tower, now Willis Tower, there was an effort to create block clubs, but they had a much more antagonistic relationship between the block clubs and the sponsoring organizations. So I would say that Edgewater is an example of a particularly effective form of top-down organizing. Yes, in the green, please.
I keep thinking bigger, like I see all of this as part of such an American tradition of organizing and we the people, and you think about like Tocqueville's observations that he documented in Democracy in America. He's talking about these people are forever forming associations of all sorts, and we know about like the little organizations and the little New England towns and things. So I really see all of this as such an American story and maybe even a human story.
I agree that there's a very American story. I would say, though, that it was not clear at the formation of the United States that associational life would become what it was. There's actually a lovely book that talks about this history and points out that if you think about the First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly. That is to go out on the streets and protest, right, in the revolutionary tradition. It does not guarantee freedom of association. And it was not clear in the first 30 or 40 years of U.S. history that the associational life that we take for granted today would occur, because it was not clear that Americans would be allowed to organize organizations that would have recognition from the government, including questions about like, should there be private colleges, even though places like Harvard already existed. But by the time Tocqueville was traveling in the young United States in the 1830s, Americans had become associationalized. And then there is a larger trajectory of associational life, including neighborhood organizations, including just thinking about Chicago, the history of improvement associations, which sound like they're designed to clean up streets, but are actually also very often racially motivated efforts to keep segregation.
Labor unions and
Yes.
like if people have looked at the intersection between those kinds of groups and these kinds of
So let me just tell you the story of that. So I'm very interested in the larger history of community-based organizations, some of which is related to the history of labor organizing, especially through Saul Alinsky, who learned part of his technique from labor organizers. He was fascinated with John Lewis. And so I ran into Brad's colleague, Tim Guilfoyle, about 10 years ago, who was doing some editing for a project that was supposed to sort of document all of American history through topical articles. And I said, oh, who do you have writing the history of community-based organizations? And his face fell. Like, and nobody had thought of it, so it wasn't on his list. And I should have kept my big mouth shut, because about 2 days later, what should show up in my inbox but an invitation to write that entry. And then I literally spent 5 years unable to write that article because it's such a broad, it requires such a broad synthesis, and nobody had done it. And I literally kept trying to give it back to the editor. I'm like, I can't do this. And they were like, oh, we'll give you another year. That's fine, we'll just push it down. And after the third time I tried to give it back, I woke up one morning and started writing it. And so I eventually was able to write a synthesis of the history of community-based organizations. I don't think it's great, but it does sort of give the overarching history. I cite Tocqueville, he went to exactly the right spot. And then it really picks up in the United States in the 1890s, and the 1890s to the 21st century, with a key moment in the post-war period when the 501c3 organization is created in the tax code. We have some questions in the back.
Yes. Do you treat the experience of congregations and the clergy in the evolution of these groups? Because in Edgewater in 1960, there was a big group of clergymen who got it off the pad, so to speak. And then, of course, everything Linsky ever did involved clerical leaders and parishes.
I think that's a great point. I don't treat it separately or much at all. The role of religion in American cities is actually understudied, and so I don't think that my consciousness was high enough to do that, but you're right that there are certainly places where clergy and churches and parishes and synagogues have been very important organizers for their neighborhoods as well. Yes?
Also, what's unusual in Edgewater, it was the women in this community that turned it around, specifically, starting with Mary Lou Hedlund, elected as alderwoman in 1971. And women continued to be alderwomen until Mary Austin was elected. And they turned this board around. And a lot of the women sitting in this room, Pat Sharkey, Kathy Everly, so many women were the ones that created these block clubs and created the change in this neighborhood. And as I'm just going to say, we have an exhibit at the museum right now about women's leadership in Edgewater and what they did and what we created and what the importance was. I mean, they were catalysts for this whole block club, ECC, ECRA, and everybody getting together and working together to change our neighborhood.
I think that's also a great point. Women's roles in organizing are underestimated, in part because in many circumstances, men took the top leadership positions in organizations. They were sort of nominally in charge as, say, the president of the organization, and then it was women who were the drivers, who were vice presidents, treasurers, clerks, etc. And that comported with the dominant gender strategies of, say, the 1950s and 1960s, in which women were presumed not to be as civically engaged as we imagine in the 21st century. But there's subtle clues. So one of my favorite examples that just made me roll my eyes every time I came across it was there was one organization on the south side that very intentionally, I think it was Hyde Park, set their block club meetings for 8 o'clock at night, because that would be after the kids went to bed. So presumably the mothers were off duty at that time. I always rolled my eyes because, like, I can't get my kids to go to bed. So, you know, by 7:30 would be trusted to be sound asleep and sleep through the night. When I was writing this book, they were too small. They were just up at all hours. But they set the meetings around women's schedules. So yeah, I think that's exactly right. Not just in Edgewater, but elsewhere as well. Thank you for sharing that. John?
So I just wanted to maybe catch you up a little bit on what's been going on here. So as Pat noted, that there was a very intentional effort to make sure that all of Edgewater was covered by block clubs. Some have been very robust throughout the entire last 50, 60 years. Some have kind of ebbed and flowed. Epic has been kind of in the middle tier, I would guess. I don't know if you ever interviewed Lynn Pierce. She was a pit bull of a community organizer, and she got me to take over the presidency. She was becoming ill, and she wanted to pass the baton. I had already been long-time block club president in Uptown, and I feel like it's a role I can hardly run away from fast enough. So it's very time intensive, but I mean it's very worthwhile. I was on a very kind of close street. It's Dover Street in Uptown. It's just east of Clark, and it was a lovely street with a lot of really interesting, beautiful homes and lovely apartment buildings and so forth. So that community had a real identity for going back to like World War II, and they had, they're probably like approaching their 80th year of having a block party every year, so it was mainly a social thing, but increasingly when a neighborhood is challenged, this is when block clubs really have to kind of swing into action.
Yeah, and I would suggest, based on those comments and also the really rich comments that you've all shared with each other during this conversation, not just with me, but you're learning about the history of your neighborhood from each other. This would be something that would be beautiful to document, right? So I would suggest what you should do is get a bunch of young people, get students from the local high school, get some of Brad's students from Loyola, which I realize is Rogers Park rather than Edgewater, and get them to interview you all, record them, and make those records part of your permanent legacy so that the knowledge that you all in this room have is not lost and that can be shared. That's not something that, like, I'm effectively an outside researcher at this point. That's not something that I could do, but it's definitely something that your organization could do and would benefit generations.
It has a lot of oral histories.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Scores of
Yeah.
oral histories.
Well, I won't say it. I was gonna say with AI, you could do a lot to create something new out of that.
Way to create hallucinations too.
Yeah, but with, you know, journalistic and research-based fact-checking, you could really kind of mine that website and do some cool things. I just wanted to make a comment. Actually, I wasn't sure if I would want to make it publicly. I worked for the city in 1995 when we had the heat wave, and our major effort for communications at that time into the neighborhoods was through a list of block clubs. When the, you know, when people were dying and everybody, you know, the press was up in arms, the major tool we had for reaching out into the neighborhoods was this list that was used by the city's what?
Mayor's Office of Information and Inquiry.
Yes,
Oh, yes.
the Mayor's Office of Information and Inquiry, and actually that, it was very effective because reaching out to the people who were captains of those clubs, they paid attention to the people in their neighborhoods and checked up on the older folks.
Yeah, that's part of my argument here is that like neighboring is crucial, and that's what you do in block clubs.
Yeah.
It sort of feels like we're coming to the conclusion of the questions.
Thank you.
One more? Let's do one more and then we can chat after as needed.
Okay, it's basically information. Even before the 70s or 60s, in the turn of the century and a little before, there were things called improvement associations, geographically based volunteer organizations. I haven't written it yet, but there was the Edgewater Improvement Association, and then the North Edgewater, and the West Edgewater. So, you know, and Ravenswood. So it was still, there were a number in the city of Chicago.
Yes, there were dozens, and actually you want to be careful when you write about the history of improvement associations in particular. There's the most cited master's thesis that I've ever run across in my career was written by Zarita Mikva, which is about the history of improvement associations in Chicago. I think it's in the 1940s, and she documented dozens of them, and she was very clear in her analysis that those were instruments of racial segregation, that they sounded great, because they were like, who could argue with improvement? But in the time, improvement meant keeping black people out because there was a set of racist assumptions about how African Americans affected neighborhoods.
Maybe it would have been in certain areas, but it wasn't in Edgewater.
I don't know about Edgewater in particular, but there's a wonderful map in her book that or her master's thesis, which is at the University of Chicago, that I would refer you to, so, as you do that project. You know, but every neighborhood has its own history. So thank you all so much for coming out today.